The year was 1939. Europe stood on the precipice of the most devastating conflict in human history. But what if things had unfolded differently? What if the catastrophic events that would claim over 70 million lives could have been prevented? Today, we examine the critical moments, missed opportunities, and alternative paths that might have changed the course of history. This is not a story of what was, but of what could have been. Through the lens of historical analysis, we'll explore the frightening truth: World War II was not inevitable. The traditional narrative suggests that war was the inevitable culmination of forces set in motion decades earlier. Yet this fatalistic view overlooks the countless individual choices, diplomatic failures, and strategic miscalculations that turned manageable crises into global catastrophe. From the peace negotiations of 1919 to the final diplomatic overtures of August 1939, decision-makers repeatedly chose paths that led toward war rather than away from it. To understand how the war might have been prevented, we must first examine its roots. The harsh terms of the Treaty of Versailles in 1919 left Germany economically crippled and politically humiliated. The treaty demanded massive reparations, territorial losses, and military restrictions that would fuel resentment for decades. Many historians argue that a more moderate peace settlement could have changed everything. Instead of punishing Germany so severely, the Allied powers might have chosen reconstruction over retribution. The economic devastation that followed created the perfect conditions for extremist ideologies to flourish. By 1923, hyperinflation had destroyed the German middle class. A wheelbarrow full of money couldn't buy a loaf of bread. When the global economic depression struck in 1929, it found Germany already wounded and vulnerable. Unemployment soared to 6 million people. Democracy appeared to have failed. The contrast with the post-World War II reconstruction is striking. After 1945, the Marshall Plan invested in rebuilding former enemies rather than destroying them. This approach created stable democracies and lasting peace in Western Europe. Had similar wisdom prevailed in 1919, the economic desperation that made radical solutions attractive might never have developed. Instead, the victorious powers demanded payments that Germany could not afford while simultaneously restricting its ability to earn the foreign currency needed to make those payments. In this climate of desperation, radical political movements gained unprecedented support. The National Socialist German Workers' Party, led by Adolf Hitler, promised simple solutions to complex problems. They offered scapegoats for Germany's suffering and visions of restored greatness. But their rise was not inevitable. In the 1928 elections, they received only 2.6% of the vote. Even at their peak in 1932, they never won a majority. The appointment of Hitler as Chancellor in January 1933 was the result of political miscalculation by conservative politicians who believed they could control and use him. What if President Hindenburg had refused to appoint Hitler? What if the Social Democrats and Communists had united against the common threat instead of fighting each other? What if the international community had intervened when democratic institutions began to crumble? These were the first missed opportunities that could have changed history. The fragmentation of Germany's democratic opposition proved fatal. While extremists unified around a single message of national revival, democratic parties remained divided by ideology and personal rivalries. The Communist Party, following directives from Moscow, actually viewed the Social Democrats as their primary enemy, calling them social fascists. This fatal miscalculation prevented the formation of a united front that might have preserved German democracy. Meanwhile, conservative politicians like Franz von Papen convinced themselves they could use the extremists for their own purposes, fatally underestimating both their ruthlessness and their popular appeal. Once in power, the regime moved quickly to consolidate control. The Reichstag fire in February 1933 provided a pretext for suspending civil liberties. By March, the Enabling Act gave the government dictatorial powers. Opposition parties were banned, trade unions dissolved, and a one-party state established. The international response was largely passive. Many foreign observers initially viewed these developments as Germany's internal affairs. Some even saw the new government as a bulwark against communism. This was a critical miscalculation. When Germany withdrew from the League of Nations in October 1933, it sent a clear signal about future intentions. When the regime began systematic persecution of Jewish citizens, it revealed its true nature. Yet the world watched, often in silence. Economic interests and the desire to avoid another war trumped moral concerns. The remilitarization of the Rhineland in March 1936 was perhaps the last easy opportunity to stop what was coming. German forces were under strict orders to withdraw if met with resistance. France had the military superiority to act, but lacked the political will. Britain was unwilling to support military action over what seemed like Germany simply moving troops into its own territory. The tragedy of this period lies in how predictable the escalation was to those who chose to see it. The regime's own publications and speeches openly declared their intentions for territorial expansion and racial supremacy. The 1935 Nuremberg Laws codified discrimination into state policy. The 1936 Olympics provided a veneer of respectability while persecution continued behind closed doors. Each unchallenged action emboldened the next, creating momentum that would become increasingly difficult to stop. International business leaders continued trading with Germany, prioritizing profits over principles, while diplomatic channels remained focused on accommodation rather than accountability. The policy of appeasement, most famously embodied by British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain, was based on the belief that Germany's grievances were legitimate and that war could be avoided through negotiation and compromise. The annexation of Austria in March 1938 was met with international protests but no action. When attention turned to Czechoslovakia and its German-speaking Sudetenland, the stage was set for the Munich Conference. In September 1938, Britain, France, and Italy agreed to German demands, believing they had secured peace for a time, but appeasement only emboldened further aggression. Each unopposed move strengthened Germany militarily and psychologically. The seizure of the rest of Czechoslovakia in March 1939 finally shattered illusions about peaceful intentions, but by then, it was almost too late. What if the Western democracies had stood firm earlier? What if they had honored their commitments to defend smaller nations? What if economic sanctions had been implemented consistently? Military historians argue that Germany was not ready for a major war until 1940 or 1941. The moral dimension of appeasement cannot be ignored. By sacrificing Czechoslovakia, the Western powers abandoned a functioning democracy with modern armed forces and strong defensive positions. The Czechs were never consulted about their own fate. President Beneš was simply presented with an ultimatum: accept dismemberment or face Germany alone. The abandoned Czech fortifications and armaments significantly strengthened German military capacity. More devastating was the signal sent to smaller nations, that their larger neighbors could not be trusted to honor their commitments when tested. This erosion of collective security made further aggression not just possible, but probable. Perhaps the most shocking development was the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact of August 1939. The non-aggression agreement between Germany and the Soviet Union eliminated the possibility of a two-front war and included secret protocols for dividing Poland and Eastern Europe. This alliance of convenience between ideological enemies stunned the world. Many communist parties outside Germany had been staunchly anti-fascist. The pact left them confused and demoralized. More importantly, it gave Germany the green light to attack Poland without fear of immediate Soviet intervention. But what if Stalin had chosen differently? What if he had allied with Britain and France instead? Preliminary discussions had been taking place throughout 1939. The Western powers were reluctant to guarantee Soviet territorial gains or allow Soviet troops through Poland and Romania. Their suspicion of communist intentions proved costly. An anti-German alliance including the Soviet Union might have deterred the invasion of Poland entirely. Even if war had begun, a two-front conflict could have ended it quickly, before it spread across the globe. Stalin's calculations were brutally pragmatic. He believed that a war between Germany and the Western powers would weaken both sides, leaving the Soviet Union stronger relative to its neighbors. The secret protocols gave him territories in Eastern Europe without having to fight for them. But Stalin fundamentally miscalculated Germany's military capabilities and timeline. He expected a long, grinding war like World War I, not the swift conquest that would leave Germany dominant in Western Europe by 1940. The pact also eliminated any possibility of containing German expansion through collective security, turning what might have been a limited conflict into a global catastrophe that would eventually consume the Soviet Union itself. Historical analysis reveals multiple points where different decisions could have prevented or limited the conflict. Stronger international institutions might have provided frameworks for peaceful resolution. More decisive action against early aggression could have deterred further expansion. Different economic policies after World War I might have prevented the conditions that made extremism attractive. Even as late as 1939, some possibilities remained. If the invasion of Poland had been met with immediate, overwhelming force from the West, if the Soviet Union had honored its non-aggression pacts with Poland, if neutral countries had aligned against aggression from the beginning, the war might have been contained or ended quickly. the role of individual decision-makers cannot be understated. Different leaders making different choices at crucial moments could have altered the entire trajectory of the 20th century. A more flexible French government in 1936, a more decisive British response to early German violations, a more unified German opposition, or a more internationally minded American administration earlier in the decade, any of these changes might have prevented the crisis from reaching the point of no return. The tragedy is that the tools for prevention existed: international law, economic pressure, military deterrence, and diplomatic engagement. What was lacking was the political will to use them effectively before it was too late. The frightening truth is that World War II was not the inevitable result of unstoppable historical forces. It was the product of specific decisions made by real people at critical moments. Each choice to appease rather than confront, to prioritize short-term interests over long-term stability, to remain passive in the face of growing threats, contributed to the catastrophe that followed. Understanding these missed opportunities is not merely an academic exercise. The patterns of escalating authoritarianism, international passivity, and the failure of democratic institutions to respond effectively to existential threats remain relevant today. The lessons of the 1930s remind us that the price of inaction can be measured not just in politics or economics, but in human lives. History does not repeat, but it often rhymes. By studying what could have been prevented, we better understand our responsibility to prevent similar tragedies in our own time. The question is not whether World War II could have been stopped, but whether we have learned enough from that failure to stop the next catastrophe before it begins. Perhaps the most sobering lesson is how ordinary the people were who made these fateful decisions. They were not monsters or incompetents, but individuals operating within the constraints of their time, their information, and their political systems. Their failures remind us that preventing catastrophe requires not just good intentions, but institutional wisdom, moral courage, and the willingness to act on principle even when the costs are high. The alternative, as history shows us, can be immeasurably worse.